My name is Alexis Grinde. I work at the Natural Resources Research Institute, and I run the Forest and Lands group and also the Avian Ecology Research group. You're going to hear from a bunch of awesome people from my lab today, and then also I'll be working with Marcella, and she'll be presenting. We're sort of going to be tag teaming quite a bit. We're long-term buddies on a lot of different projects, but she's the silviculturist, I'm wildlife ecologist, and we can be best friends. And so that's a really fun sort of approach to the world and all of our research. Josh Kolash is my grad student, and he's going to be talking a little bit. And then Josh Bednar from NRI also will be talking a little bit as the next 2 hours sort of progress. So today we're going to be like really talking a lot about forestry for the birds, which is a labor of love. You'll hear a lot about it throughout the day. I think I personally am far enough removed that I can look back and say, gosh, that was fun. It wasn't fun for Christian. Are you there yet? Was it fun for you guys? Yeah. But it was years and years of us trying to get funding to do the dang thing and to actually like stick with it. And we had so many fun meetings. It was such a great group of people to work with. But really Christian, Peter, and Mike were big pushing forces when I was like, I hate this thing. I don't want to do it. They were like, you got to do it. And so it's great to see it out and that we can sort of use it and it's a tool. But then just other folks too that, have been really awesome for our lab in terms of birds and forestry and sort of thinking about these things holistically are Eli, Mark Jacobs, Dave, Todd Tisler from Chippewa National Forest, Mike North from Minnesota DNR. I was on the steering committee for the Northern Bird Network for a really long time, and it was a great community. Just again, sort of thinking about these things, make sure that passion is ignited and continuing on a regular basis. Since Jamie took over, we've had a lot of great resources coming out. I'm really proud of the work we did there, and so a big shout out to those guys. We're going to talk a lot about peatlands today. When we first started studying peatlands, it was not really a system that was being studied. So we were starting from the ground up, and Marcella will talk a lot about that. But Marcella and then Rob Slezak, who's now out west, it was a labor of love trying to get funding for it. And now we've been going many years and we've been learning so much. And then there's a whole bunch of other folks that actually do the work, like Laura, Alan, Steve, Josh, Kara. And then Charlie at the Minnesota DNR has been great for helping us do a lot of the studies too. So I want to say thank you to them. And then of course, all the folks that work in my lab, the avian ecology lab, we have a ton of fun. They're the very best and smartest scientists, and they know the most about birds and forestry. And again, you'll be hearing a lot about them. So anyway, so I don't run short on the thank yous. I wanted to put that up front. So a little bit of an overview. I'm going to give an introduction about just sort of what we're talking about today, why we needed forestry for the birds. I'll hand the baton over to Marcella. She'll talk about just sort of the state of Minnesota's forests, the intro to silviculture, and then sort of transition into a case study of peatlands where we're really thinking about the need to do something a little bit different. I'll come back and talk about bird communities, and then Josh will be talking a little bit about some more really specific experiments that we have going on. And then Maya from, I think the Nature Conservancy will be talking at the end. So like I said, the forestry for the birds, labor of love, still maybe a little painful memories, but it was great. It's such a good, fun learning experience to talk and meet with and hear all sorts of different perspectives. Hopefully you guys got the guidebook. It's beautiful. I'm really, really proud of it. And I'm grateful to have been a part of it. But what is it? So Minnesota is not the first state to do this. I think we're the first state to do it perfectly, though. Just kidding. But it is a set of voluntary science-based forest practices, right? And the overall goal when it was developed actually out east was to enhance habitat for priority species, birds in general, right? And so we can do this when we really think about what else do birds need besides just the timber side of things when we're doing forest management. And so what kind of information do we need? What kind of tweaks can we make? That sort of thing. But why would we ever even need to consider birds in the first place? That's sort of the question that I'll get to. And so we're going to take a walk in time history. We're going to meander back to the pre-settlement era. And you can imagine at this point in time, there was a lot more forest cover in general. From what we know, the forests were shaped primarily by these natural sort of disturbances. The dominant cover was a lot of old growth, white pine. red pine, lots of diverse northern hardwoods. There was, of course, human influence from the indigenous people that lived in the Great Lakes area. And I should say forestry maybe uses the term Great Lakes forests. Bird people, we use Bird Conservation Region 12. So those are the same thing if we accidentally slip into that. That's okay. And so, so that's that pre-settlement time. And then of course, the 1840s, to about the early 1900s, we had that big cutover area where people were like, wow, these trees are huge, let's cut them all down. And so there was just pure extraction. Of course, that had a lot to do with a lot of the sort of social and economic times back then. But there was a complete landscape conversion, more or less, until 1910 or so. In 1911, Minnesota established the State Forest Service, which is cool, right? But that only happened after there was a huge catastrophic sort of fires across, you can see. Did you have a question? Yeah.
No, I was gonna say, if we could demo this a little better, go back there.
Of the big Hinckley fire, if you guys have seen the museum around. So what did that mean for habitat? We went from like this really diverse mosaic of a lot of different cover types and a lot of different age classes that were, experiencing natural disturbances to, in about 50 years, basically a clear cut across the state for a lot of different forest cover types. And we lost all those old growth characteristics, and we had maybe regeneration that was happening. Thank you, Marcella. So, that was the bad news. And then the Depression came, and then we decided to sort of suppress fires in general. And then the Civilian Conservation Corps came along and started replanting a lot of trees. That's great. So we sort of have these reforestation efforts. As those sort of ended up growing, we had these, like I said, these pioneer species, a lot of aspen, a lot of birch. But so more of a transition to different kind of forest types than what were naturally there the 50 years prior. The forest stabilized, providing some mid-successional habitat. Overall, what does that mean for the bird habitat? Well, we don't know, we weren't monitoring birds back then, but we can imagine that we probably had a big increase in populations of birds that like sort of a mid-succession kind of a forest. But those species that maybe rely on old growth or these fire maintained or these natural disturbances were probably declining in the state at the time. So then we transitioned to the 1960s, the 1980s, industrial multiple use management, sustained yield. That was sort of the focus culturally back then, right? So we have, okay, let's start managing our lands for wildlife, for recreation and timber. We have a lot of different federal things that are happening at that time. In the 1970s, basically because of birds, so bald eagles, peregrine falcons, that sort of thing, we realized that we're doing some bad things to the environment in terms of pesticides. We saw declining populations. That was sort of the start of a big environmental movement of like, hey, how are we treating the environment? What's going on here in terms of industry? And because of that, we started nationally something called the Breeding Bird Surveys, which is a BBS, and it's a volunteer sort of a survey route. Some of you guys maybe have run them in the past before. But this was the start of us monitoring wildlife to see, well, how are we affecting it? What are these changes over time? This is a hugely powerful influence to how we understand bird communities and management today, back in the 70s, right? So the focus went from efficient sort of timber yield, but we had these large tracts of even age stands. So for bird habitat, again, we don't have that complexity, that diversity that probably the bird communities needed, again, before we did the big cutover. So, as we get into the 1990s, forest management started really becoming increasing again, became more profitable again in the Great Lakes region. And there was a lot of concern based on the environmental movement in the 1970s, like, we've done this wrong, we don't want huge fires, how do we do it right this time? How do we do both economics and manage our natural resources appropriately? So this is when the Natural Resources Research Institute, where I work, was founded, and it was governed, I guess, by the legislation of Minnesota. And it's also when we started the Minnesota National Forest Breeding Bird Program, because we really wanted to understand what was going on in managed forests, off-road, across these big landscapes. And so that is ongoing, and I'll talk about that more in a minute. In 2000s, we started really seeing these documented declines in bird populations, especially out east. But we had pockets and different changes that were happening, and really bird conservation became a really important thing. The American Bird Conservancy, Partners in Flight, Road to Recovery. We started really thinking about how can we manage these birds before they go on the endangered species list. Which brings us to present day, where we're really thinking about this more holistically in terms of ecosystems. How are we thinking about these different cover types, successional stages, natural disturbances, and how do we work with forestry or any land management agency really to better equip the overall landscape to handle all of these changes that are happening and really promote resilience? Which brings us again back to the Forestry for Minnesota Birds. And that's all great, with that focus on sort of forest succession and maybe the cultural changes that were happening. But of course, we have to put the context of the world is changing like super fast in many, many ways, right? So we're experiencing an unprecedented rate of environmental change in terms of climate, in terms of the big impact of forest pests, of invasive species. Whatever it is, the world is changing really, really quickly. And so we're sort of thinking about back in the 1840s, what are those conditions? How are they changing? How have our management sort of influenced what we have to work with now? And how do we promote that resilience into the future, given all these different environmental changes, right? This is the really important context. How do we make sure all these forested lands stay forested? How do we make sure the populations stay increasing and not decreasing, and we're not losing species out of our forests here in the Great Lakes region? How do we do that? I don't know, but we're going to talk about it in a bit. One of a really important paper that just came out pre-COVID, I guess 2019, is that we used those breeding bird surveys that we started in the 1970s, did a bunch of different statistics on them. And we found that North America, since 1970s, again, since the environmental movement sort of started and we started being good stewards of the environment, we've lost about 3 billion birds, and forest bird populations have declined by 1.2 billion birds in just North America. That's a really substantial loss of diversity and overall abundance. A lot of the key factors are related to habitat loss, land use conversion, fragmentation, invasive species, climate change, changes in food web. All of these different things are interacting together, and in general, for any given species in a population that's declining, it's not one thing that's causing it, it's many things that are causing it. And so we need to think about what's the big impacts, or what are the big things that we can do to mitigate these declines. But in general, things aren't going well if you're a person that cares about birds, bird populations. And so again, what can we do about it? Well, it's hard to think about North America's bird populations. And so I like to think about Minnesota's bird populations because it's a little bit more tangible. We can sort of think about what's happening on a more local or refined scale, even though Minnesota is a really large state. And so again, in the early 1990s, we established the Minnesota National Forest Breeding Bird Monitoring Program in Chippewa and Superior National Forest. You can see on that map, all of the dots, the red and the yellow, are survey sites that were established back then. And since 1995, we have visited them annually. So this was just our 31st year of monitoring of the monitoring program. And it's all off-road, it's all cover type specific. It's all, we're tracking also what's happening to the stands and the stand dynamics. The overall goals of our monitoring program are to track population trends of these different forest birds, try and identify potential concerns, think about just habitat and landscape associations. We didn't know a lot about forest bird communities and what they liked and what structures they were responding to back in the 90s. We know a lot about it now. They really complemented the breeding bird surveys, which are on roads. And so we could kind of put those two things together and see where we were seeing some commonalities or maybe some discrepancies. And then ultimately, we want to inform forest management. When we look at our trends over 31 years, our goal is to sort of make sure that these common species that have been common and will continue to be common, or will continue to stay common. And also that we want to focus on the species of conservation interests that are having population declines or maybe a low abundance or maybe habitat specialists. So you guys don't care about the methods, but we have really cool methods. And I mean, in general, these guys go out into these back forests and all of the month of June. Reed leads it. You'll hear from him later. They try not to get charged by bears, apparently was a thing this year. They try not to bleed out from mosquito bites, et cetera, et cetera. But we document all the breeding birds that we hear. It's a pretty rigorous test. In order to be a surveyor on our monitoring program, you have to identify over 110 different species by sound alone. And so these guys are the best of the best. If you're interested in the overall results, I'm not going to talk about them in any sort of detail, but there, I made a QR code because I'm fancy, and we have a story map that you can take a look at. That's only updated through 2024 at this point. But in general, what do we see? Are there alarm bells at these local population declines? And the answer is kind of like yes and no. Quite honestly, Minnesota's national forests are awesome at managing forest birds. And they are awesome at it because there's a lot of Minnesota's forest birds, over 200 species, and they are, a lot of them are dependent on mature forests, and there's a lot of mature forests in the national forest, and that's awesome. But we have seen as the decades have gone by that there's more and more species of birds that are declining over time. So they have decreasing population trends. And because that trend is trending, we really wanted to think more about what species are declining and why, and what can we do about it. And so in general, just to interpret some of our trends, and again, we get trends for over 80 species. We think about the ecological sort of requirements of these 80 different species. Again, let me just be clear. There's like 8 species of mammals in Minnesota. We have 250 species of birds. There's 80 species that we're thinking about the ecological context. So if anybody's young and wondering about career choices, being a mammologist is way easier than being an ecologist. Just kidding, guys. But there's 80 species that we think about, right? So we get these huge PDF files and we just go through them and we're like, maybe this, maybe that, trying to think about all the things that we need to understand what's happening, right? So in general, there are species that are just love a forest. They don't care if it's aspen or if it's birch or if it's oak. They just don't care. We call those the generalist ones. Those guys are doing pretty well in terms of the bird trends. On the other side, we have the specialists. These are guys that have a really specific need for maybe a certain age class, maybe a specific cover type, maybe a certain microhabitat within a cover type, right? So those are really, really specialists. Maybe there's a certain food that they're looking at. And those are the guys that are doing not so great. Another way to sort of think about this is in terms of how does birds sort of indicators of overall forest health is how they do habitat selection. And so if maybe some of you guys aren't familiar with this, but this is from a Johnson paper back in the 1980s that sort of is really foundational for habitat selection for wildlife. But essentially we start with this like range. Are they in Minnesota? Are they in the forests of Minnesota? Sure. And then we think about the landscape. Okay, so imagine a bird's flying back from South or Central America, and they sort of see this vast forest in Minnesota, right? And they're like, yeah, that's the spot. That looks awesome. So that's the landscape order where they're like, yeah, I'm gonna move in here for the summer. Then we have the stand structure, where they sort of go down to another level. And again, this is where we manage, right? As forest managers, we manage at that stand level, but birds are responding to different levels above that. So that's an important piece too. And then so they go down and they're flying around in the forest and they're looking for a structure that's really important for them. And then within that stand, they're also looking for a microhabitat that where they can put their nest sites. They have these perching spots available. They have these foraging spots available, whatever. And so there's a lot of scales, right, that these birds are responding to. And again, if you're a generalist, you don't have really those many specific requirements. If you're a specialist, you're specialized in every single thing that you're choosing. And so what we see again for these trends when we look at them through that lens of ecological requirements is that the generalists are doing great. We have good general forests for a lot of our forest birds. That's awesome. That's not the case throughout North America. So Minnesota is awesome in that regard. There's a lot of species, we don't know what's happening with them. They just sort of are teetering back and forth. There's a lot of dynamics that affect bird populations. But what we do know in Minnesota is that a lot of our habitat specialists are declining. And it's a lot of those specialists that are, again, sort of related to these structural, compositional diversity that's associated with some older stands that we just don't get with the typical, for example, aspen forest management, or like we're going to talk about black spruce management here in a minute. And so what can we do about that? Well, let's create that structure. Let's create that compositional diversity. Let's do things a little bit differently if we want to help increase the populations of some of these specialists. And we can do that. So sustainable forest management creates habitat that supports diverse breeding bird communities. Awesome. And we need to consider alternative management in some places, in some land cover types to maintain different habitat features or create them for long term. So again, now coming back to our forestry for the birds, really a lot of the tweaks, as we called them, in our forestry for the birds manual, a lot of it is, you hear these words again, biodiversity, structure, resilience. These are things that are good, right? We love biodiversity. Structure is cool, probably. Resilience, that sounds like an awesome thing to do. And if we can sort of take these birds and their habitat needs and use that to create our management plans and make sure that we're sort of putting in these, or accounting for a lot of these diversity structures as resilience, we're going to have a healthier forest sort of overall. So this is an awesome graphic. I don't know how well you guys can see it, but is it Lana? Is that who the graphic designer was? She made this, and it's all, conifers mixed to hardwoods, and then sort of the understory, overstory, and we have the birds sort of planted around. This is an imaginary forest, but this is Christian's joke, actually. He says, woodcock invites pine warbler to dinner, too close to the ground, not enough pines, 1 star. I stole that, but I gave you credit, but I did make it into a goose, so. But this is just basically saying different birds need different spots in the forest, right? And in order for us to have a diverse bird community in Minnesota, we need to think about all these different components that these birds are sitting on and make sure that just one thing isn't going to be good enough for all of the species, right? So in summary, managing for birds, and we'll get to sort of, hopefully we'll build evidence for this, all of these things that I'm about to say here. Managing for birds is ecological forestry. Managing for birds is managing for resilience. Managing for birds is managing for forest health. Those are all really awesome things. Managing for birds provides guidelines for specific cover types that are a little bit different than just the silvicultural sort of timber focused approaches that a lot of us are familiar with. And what's good for birds is good for humans. And so hopefully by the end of today, you'll learn a lot of different techniques and be really passionate about birds. I made this. Thank you. Thank you. So, and hopefully you'll be as excited about birds and all of the different things we can do to conserve them at the end of today and tomorrow as well. So now I'll pass the baton over to Marcella. Wait, I made this too. I know, Marcella, disco balls lane. So.
Oh my gosh, that is amazing. Okay, Jamie, when do you want me not talking? And moving on to the next person.
Let's see. We can do the last part quick, so it's whatever.
Okay.
Yeah, 2 hours, or we don't know. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, let me know when you want me to keep moving. Okay, so I'm Marcella Windmuller-Campione. As Alexis mentioned, I am in the Department of Forestry. I am the forest silviculturist. And some of you have heard this story. I did my BS and MS in forestry. During my BS, I was like, oh my gosh, ornithology is so cool. I'm going to add this as one of my electives. And it's amazing how when you get into something that you really, really love, and I love trees, I love vegetation, you fall into this beautiful like rabbit hole of like all the things. And then I was like, okay, I hear these birds all the time. And so I took this ornithology class, and it became very, very, very clear within the first field session during that first week, I am not even close to ever being an ornithologist. And it wasn't early mornings, and it wasn't, I went to Michigan Tech, so it was a spring class. So our first field class was like January. And so I think we got out at 6 a.m. to like see the transition between like, the sunrise. It's like, okay, this is awesome. And then I was told you just have to sit and wait for the birds to come to you. And some folks who know me know I don't do staying in place really well. And this idea of like waiting for something to come and then not being able to look at it was like, what do you mean? Like, I want to be moving around. And so after that, my professor was like, there's a lot of different ways that you could help or be a part of this kind of like community without ever needing to identify birds. And I was like, okay, I think we're on the same page here. So I got really into forestry and silviculture, and still so grateful to the many people that know so much about birds that teach me every single day. And especially some of the bird sounds and signs that are really obvious that I'm like, oh, so cool. Okay, so Alexis brought this up with the change, with the history. So this is kind of where we are now. And this is from the FIA most recent report collected in 2022. And so this is our forest communities in Minnesota. And I also want to highlight our ownership. And so some of the things that we're going to be talking about today is that unlike a lot of places, we not only have a lot of different forest types, we have a lot of different forest species, we have a lot of different ownerships, and we have this all in our state, which is really, really cool, but also makes it super complex. And so as we think about what this distribution looks like, we have over 17 million acres of forest. That is pretty cool. Then we get into, as I said, all the different forest cover types. Oh, and I'm supposed to stay here so people can hear me, right? Or does that?
The owl should pick.
Okay, the owl should pick me up. I will try to stay close to that. But one of the things I want to highlight is like the other category, which is that orange category or that burnt orange is 13%. But look at that pie chart that comes out of it. How many forest types are in that other category is just amazing too. So we have a huge diversity of ecosystems, of forest types, of all these things. And I don't want to get into the numbers, but I more just want to show that over time, we see that one of the things that also is helpful in our state is we have a relatively consistent market for our forest products. And this may seem like, why am I starting out with this after I just showed you we have a lot of forests? These markets go hand in hand with us being able to manage our systems. And so some of the states and some of the regions that are really struggling right now to implement forest management are areas that lost markets. Without an active market, we can't do regular silviculture, but we can't do alternative silviculture. We can't do forestry for the birds. We can't do all of these things and do it at the scale that we need to be doing it without really, really good markets. And without the people, the logging professionals that are implementing our forest management practices. If we want to do cool stuff, those logging professionals are the ones that understand how their machines move in these complex landscapes to be able to put gaps and strips and understand the topography and understand all of these pieces. And so I'm emphasizing this because this really, really goes hand in hand if we think about how we're managing and who is actively doing the management and what that means for our communities. And with that, one of the pieces that we're seeing is we're actually seeing a decreasing amount of harvested wood coming in our state. So we're seeing a decrease there, and we're seeing a growth over harvest. So we're seeing more biomass in our forest. And we can get into what that means in terms of some of these trade-offs. But This is not a one-to-one line. So we're not harvesting everything that's regrowing. We're seeing more growth back. However, what does that mean? And that's really talking through what does that mean in terms of the forest types and how does that look? And so there's no simple answer, but mostly I want to put this up there of that we are seeing more growth in our forest than removal. And that's what you want. Like, right, when we talk about silviculture, when we talk about sustainable management, we want to make sure everything that's staying forested is staying forested and that we are always thinking towards the future. Okay, so what are our practices? So this is from the 2017 silviculture survey. We are just in the middle. I say we because Elaine Mosier is in the room and collecting those surveys. We are going to be doing an update of the survey. This survey is all management organizations in Minnesota that are not family private landowners. And the goal of this is to capture what's going on. And we have this long data set, over 20 years of data of our forest management practices. And we can then break this out by the different organizations. I think there's a link somewhere with the citation, and by the different things. One of the things that I think is always really, really interesting is the idea of our size of harvest is not, especially for our clear cut, and some of these look a little bigger. But mind you, that's in a landscape level context. And some of those landscape level contexts are important. But in general, we have pretty small management areas. So how do we stack these together? How do we fit these together to create these landscapes that allow for the multiple uses and multiple benefits that we're wanting to get? Okay, so 1.5% of acres treated using even age meltas use a shelter wood, compared to 2.7 in 2018. So we're seeing a slight change. But one of the things that we're also seeing is our average clear cut size is 92 in 2017, 25 in 2008. And some of that shift in acres actually relates to the disturbances we are seeing on our landscape. So we are seeing some large disturbances that are resulting from blowdown, from ice storms, that's actually creating these large forest management practices. So Alexis mentioned we're seeing change. We are literally seeing that in what it looks like on our landscape. We're also seeing increasing amount of harvest using uneven age systems. So these systems to create that allow multiple age cohorts and create these complexes. And then the other piece that's shifting is the type and the amount of thinning we're doing. So we're seeing some shifts in this. And this is really important, especially when we think about our young stands are the best potential to create this heterogeneous habitat is in these young, early regenerating stands to start setting them up. We think about an even age system. If we can get in there and do intermediate treatments or thinnings, we can start creating gaps. We can start creating these features that we don't have to wait 100 years for. We can start creating some of these structural features. So I want to set this up as like, we're going to be collecting more data. We're seeing change. We've seen changes. And so the silviculture and forest community is really responsive to how these show up on the landscape. And at the same time, when we have big weather events, those are some of the defining features that then create that year. So we are surveying from the fiscal year of 2024 or 2025 in our survey. There was some kind of extreme events that happened during those years, some blowdowns. And so what we capture is how those features end up shaping the management that we're doing, as well as the general trends. Okay, so things that are changing, lots of things are changing. And Alexis highlighted the big picture things. The ones that I want to show is some of these things that really make a difference in terms of both wildlife, but from a forest management perspective, these things are impacting us. is nights less than 0 degrees. And seeing that shift, that freezing temperatures are really important when we think about, I'm gonna shift into lowland conifers in a second. But if we think about frozen ground and the ability to manage, we need frozen ground in these systems. If we are not getting frozen ground, we're not able to do management. And the best management is when we pair what is happening with the site and the silvics of the species. So, right, if we can do a harvest when that species is producing seed and create that seed bed for regeneration and all those stuff, great. But if we're not getting reliably cold winters, that's not going to happen. And so being able to have these conditions change is really going to impact how frequently and how consistently we can do some of these practices that call for us to kind of shift what we're doing normally. And then the final part is that rain. The timing, the frequency, the severity, all those things are shifting and what that means in terms of our forest ecosystems. Okay, so now what? So, I like to joke silviculture is the center of the world. And this was not made by a silviculturist. This was made by a biometrician. But they put silviculture right at that center, right in this of it's supposed to be integrating all these pieces. No one piece is more important than the other. And the piece with silviculture too is this balance of what do we know about the site? What do we know about all these biological, ecological, physical components of that? And then how do we balance that in terms of the logistics and the policy, as well as the ability to do this management in a way that makes either a profit or at least breaks even? And so one of the pieces that we've been working on, myself and some colleagues, is that the definition of silviculture has been a little outdated. And one of the pieces that was outdated that we took out was that silviculture had the word control in it. So it had it as silviculture is the art and science of controlling. That was not the way I was taught. That was not the way I learned. That's not most of the way that silviculturists think. We acknowledge we have very little control of so much. But we are stewards. And the piece that maybe is surprising is that silviculture as an art has been part of the definition from a Western science lens since like 1910. So that art has always been a component of silviculture. The art has actually been there before the science even. The idea that each forest is unique, you have to understand the forest, you have to understand the site, and you have to be able to consider those pieces. And then we use this foundation of information and science to consider how we are stewarding the forest. And so when we think about what that means in terms of ecological forestry or ecological silviculture, we're often balancing a lot of pieces. And so silviculturists love things in triangles or things of threes. I don't know. We just love threes. And so this is another example of this idea of threes and this tabletop of for ecological forestry, you need legacy retention, you need intermediate treatments, and you need recovery period. This idea that there is this broad part of how a system functions and that there are really important components that we need to acknowledge. Another forester or silviculturist puts these into a triad concept, again, threes, with the idea that there's this range on a landscape of meeting these multiple values. And so with ecological reserves, with new forestry or ecological forestry, and then high yield plantation. So the idea that across this gradient of a landscape, we can be meeting multiple needs. And in some areas, that means actively choosing no management, because no management is an active choice. And in some areas, that means high production, high yield on sites. But in the vast majority of places, we are thinking about the ecological management of forestry to meet these various values and goals and how we do that on a range of different treatments and management. And so this is being integrated into our forestry practices. Those who work in red pine know that we are lucky that our red pine manager's guidebook has been updated. It's one of the few that has been updated. But seeing that Brian Palick, a huge leader in this, in like how we consider the retention and distribution of those residual trees is really important. And we can get at maintaining the growth and the net economic reserves while also creating structure, creating habitat, creating these patterns on the landscape. Okay, so let's talk about lowland conifer systems. Okay, so I could talk for hours, like literally hours on these systems. They are so cool. They are so impressive. And they're also one of those systems that has had very little research since the 1960s. And if we think about the why, we have so many other forest types and so many other forest types that have things happening in them, from spongy moth to oak wilt to emerald ash borer to all of these components. They're also not super easy to get to. But they are a huge component of our forest ecosystems. And so they're highly vulnerable. So we have a few different peatland ecosystems or lowland conifer forests, and I'm going to switch between those. And this is from the Climate Change Field Guide for Northern Minnesota Forest, which is amazing. It is available as a PDF or there's a flip book. Let me know if you would like a flip book. I don't know if we have any here. Maybe I might have some in some place, potentially. Otherwise, I can make sure they get up to the CFC and can get distributed. But some of the things of the peatlands that I'm going to touch base with. When you think of a peatland, there may be more negative words that you associate with peatland forest than positive words, right? Boggy, mucky, buggy, low productivity, hard to get to, stuck, all kinds of things, water. But it's these pieces that really make them so ecologically complex. And it's pretty cool that we are in Minnesota and the Great Lakes, we are the southern extent of the boreal forest. How freaking cool is that? That we are the southern extent of the boreal forest here in Minnesota. You can go from the prairies to the boreal forest all in one state. So these systems are low nutrients, high water content, huge amount of organic soil. So just amazing. The other pieces, they are highly vulnerable, predicted to be highly vulnerable to climate change, with medium evidence and medium high agreement of what that change is going to do. Again, our acid peatland, so slightly, again, another system, but same thing, highly vulnerable and medium evidence. For two systems with this high vulnerability, you would think we would have more information on how these systems are going to change. We don't. And the other piece is these systems are a huge component of our state and of our public lands. And so this is our black spruce forest type, and I'm just going to show like the range of age classes, range of that. But the other thing is that 51% is state lands. Same story for tamarack. 51% of this forest type is in state lands. This is really unique too, because that means over half of the lands, more than half of the lands, especially when we think about county, all federal, are in ownership classes where one, that is our management goal, is to maintain a public good. And we have the capacity, because they are on these public lands, to be doing some really important work. Okay, so I mentioned harvesting. I mentioned that as a really important component in implementing any kind of forest management, but all ranges of forest management. And one of the pieces we'll talk about is that for these softwoods, we're seeing declines in these markets. And that's an important component to consider when we are thinking about how we can manage with a market that allows for this to happen. So we're seeing our spruce, that is a decline, our balsam fir, but this tamarack is very, very low. And those of you who have been working in our state and seeing the impact from eastern large beetle, that is something that is a concern of if we are seeing impact of eastern large beetle, of mortality, what does that mean in terms of maintaining and establishing new healthy tamarack forests for the future? Okay, so this is kind of the simplified peatland forest succession. This was the thought. Peatlands established after large stand replacements, mostly fire. So fire on a landscape, and our peatland forests, especially our tree species of eastern larch and black spruce, are pretty well adapted to establish after a large stand replacing disturbance. Black spruce has semi-serotinous cones, so they open in that light. The fire shifts the distribution of soil nutrients and soil resources, opening up mineral soil for that regeneration, for that recruitment. Over time, they get more complex. This is a super simplified definition. Alexis also mentioned this lens too. So as we think about the lens, this was written in the 1970s. The lens of the 1970s was maximum sustained or maximum yield. How do we maintain the most revenue and most material from our black spruce? However, that is not always the case, right? That is one value, but that's a really important lens in the time of what the primary value was. Right, okay, so it is not the 1970s, and there was a lot of research actually established during that time to look at different management techniques in the 50s and 60s. And so this is a revival of a very old study that looked at these different harvesting techniques and tools. And I'm just going to touch on a little piece of them, but the citations are here. And so one of the pieces that we saw we were not able to, the integrity of the group selection, single tree selection, and intermediate treatments was not maintained over the long term. But our clear cut patches, clear cut strips, and our shelter wood, and I say this was a true shelter wood. This was not a shelter wood with reserves, but rather a shelter wood that had the overwood removed after 10 to 15 years. One of the pieces that should maybe stand out for you is the idea of we see in our shelter woods more species, we see a greater age, we see more large diameter trees, while maintaining the really important components. We are maintaining black spruce, we are maintaining tamarack, while also recruiting other important species to increase that diversity and resilience. And so our clear-cut patches, our clear-cut strips do a good job of maintaining black spruce. Black spruce is going to come back. Our shelter wood gives us a few more options. The other piece we learned during that study is that black spruce can release. Black spruce can release from really, really small diameter trees. So if we think about those black spruce that look like seedlings or saplings, those could be like 50 years old. And that 50-year-old tree, if given light, can start growing. And so this starts to put some really important context of we have some options in terms of how we're managing and the role of regeneration, and especially advanced regeneration, in creating really diverse structure within these habitats. Okay, but if you are a forester in the audience or listening to this, you might be like, okay, well, shelterwood, that sounds great until we start talking about eastern spruce dwarf mistletoe. Okay, let's get into that. So eastern spruce dwarf mistletoe, parasitic plant, and unlike other mistletoe, so when I give this presentation to Western audience, they're like, oh, mistletoe, not a big deal. We have so many mistletoes. Our mistletoe kills trees. And they're like, what do you mean? And I was like, yeah, 17 years, this mistletoe will kill over 70% of the black spruce, which is a pretty quick death if we think about how slow some of these trees can be growing. Okay, so it's a parasitic plant. It's often found in the tops of trees and then rains down and creates these witches' brooms. And this is an area that is such great active research in for future direction. It's thought that birds who love the kind of structure that the witch's broom create move this. And so the idea is, okay, we should not be keeping residual trees because this is going to create a forest health threat. Okay, so we spent a lot of time studying this. And most of the research previously on mistletoe was done from a lens from a forest pathology perspective. And the idea that mistletoe kills black spruce. I'm going to study how mistletoe kills black spruce, not the forest composition, not the forest dynamics, not all of that. Okay, so in areas with no mistletoe, we've got, you're going to find out, I love a diameter distribution. It's amazing. Okay, so we've got our diameter distribution, we got our size classes. Our white is living black spruce. Our black is dead black spruce. And the gray is black spruce with mistletoe. We have eastern larch in green, other species, other live species in blue, other dead species in purple. So no mistletoe. We have a unimodal distribution, even age black spruce stand. This was very characteristics of even age stands. Very little mortality, and the mortality that we have is small diameter. So that's density dependent mortality. When we have low mistletoe, and this is like less than 30% of the stand has mistletoe, and some folks might be like 30%, that sounds like a lot. Okay, what we're seeing is that in general, we don't have a lot of mortality. We're still getting the same kind of distribution, and we have some eastern larch coming in. Okay, that's a plus for me. It's only when we start to get really high levels of mistletoe, so like most of the stand is infected, that we start to see that mortality from mistletoe, but we start to see that shift. But a really, really important part is we're seeing other species come in. So mistletoe can be described as this like mortality pocket or this bomb of mortality or this destructive event. And we are seeing death of black spruce. But we are also seeing other species come in and eastern larch come in. And there's some thought that this can maintain a really complex cycle and also reduce future impact of mistletoe in this site because eastern larch is not a host. And then we started did a lot of mapping. Ella Gray did a lot of mapping on this. And the other piece is not all mortality pockets are alike. So we can get some mortality pockets. These are mapped mortality pockets of black spruce. And so the top are undisturbed or no mistletoe. And so again, unimodal distribution. And the bottoms are post-mortality. So in those pockets, what's coming back? Who's coming back? And so seeing that and seeing the post-mortality, maybe you're seeing like, okay, this does not look consistent. There's a lot of different dynamics that are coming in. And Eastern spruce dwarf mistletoe is a native species. This is part of our disturbance dynamics, and these gap dynamics are foundational to these systems to create the structural and species heterogeneity. And so, how can we use or mimic mistletoe to create structure and composition, and I would say resilience in terms of the species that we're seeing, as well as the dynamics. We've seen spruce is going down in that harvestable level. Does having birch, does having maple, does having aspen does that give that stand some more ecological and economic resilience? Okay, how am I doing? Okay, okay, so our other species that we want to talk about is eastern larch, and of course, eastern larch beetle. So eastern larch, one of the cool facts that I love to say is eastern larch used to be our most dominant species in Minnesota. It used to be our most common tree species. You would never guess that if we look at our landscape now. Eastern, yeah,
When was that? Like when you say used to be?
that is from the General Land Office note. So eastern larch was the most prevalent species noted in that. So it was found on uplands, it was found on lowlands, it was found just about anywhere. It's a really cool generalist species. Now we often think of it as a lowland conifer specialist. And we also associate it with death from eastern larch beetle because we have seen an unprecedented level of outbreak happening. And this is tied to climate change impacting a native beetle to shift how it acts. Eastern larch beetle is a dendrocnus. So just like mountain pine beetle, just like spruce beetle, just like those other bark beetles. However, eastern larch beetle never really acted like a bark beetle, like a dendrocnus. It just kind of hung out. There's old literature that's like, eastern larch beetle is a beetle. It lives in the forest. That was kind of how it was described. It lives on dead trees. It's not a problem. Until it became a problem in the amount of mortality and it acting like a true dendrocnus species of doing mass attacks and attacking healthy trees. And so this mortality has been going on for a while. And one of the biggest pieces is this mortality is happening and there is very low market to be able to move into these spaces to do proactive management in these spaces to do regeneration. And so the question became, working with Minnesota DNR Forestry, is like, are these species, are we seeing regeneration? Are we maintaining a forest habitat? And so Amy Shawnette did these huge samplings, and one of the biggest things was looking at in these spaces of tamarack impacted ELB. And so we have areas with low mortality, areas with older high mortality. So this was older or longer ago in the outbreak cycle, and recent high mortality. So those areas with recent high mortality, the aim was like those stands had been impacted around 4 to 6 years ago. So really fitting in with this idea of a regeneration check at 5 years. So what is happening? So we have seedlings, saplings, and small trees. Tamarack is in the dark blue, black spruce is in the light blue, and other species are in that kind of teal blue. And one of the things that is interesting is that regeneration is present. Regeneration is present on the landscape, and it's actually our older mortality classes that we're starting to see our seedlings really come in. The biggest concern is, are those seedlings turning to saplings and then small trees? So this was a one-time sampling. So I'm hoping we can come back and look at that. The other piece that was really surprising is that tamarack is described in the literature as super shade intolerant, like the most shade intolerant conifer. So when I told Amy, like, okay, 4 of these small diameter kind of saplings, like 1 to 3 inches at the base, let's see if they established right before the outbreak or as the outbreak was progressing, or if they had to wait until after. So thinking like, okay, these are maybe at most for our older mortality stands 10 years. She started sending me pictures that looked like this. And I was like, oh, this is not what I was expecting. This is not what was described. This is not how we describe this species as needing full sunlight. And so our oldest tamarack cookie established in 1938. 74 years old when we removed it. 74, right? Is that how you would describe a super shade intolerant species that needs sunlight to hang out in the shade for 74 years? This is what I thought we were going to capture. This. Really wide growth, early establishment with the idea of, are they getting enough sunlight after ELB to grow and establish? And so what we are looking at is this kind of continuous recruitment window, which again points into there is likely some level of gap dynamics happening in these forest systems. We just haven't been looking for them. And so with this gap dynamics, how do we consider these components within our forest management practices and within our forest management plans? And so Alexis mentioned this, like, when we started this project, I had just moved here, so I had just met Alexis, and then we found out we were both pregnant at the same time. And we submitted to LCCMR, and we showed up for testimony with newborns being carried by partners and parents to testify on this. We didn't get funding that year, and so
You should have brought the baby.
yes. But the next year we did, and it was really getting at this idea of there are so many unknowns, and we can't do this alone. We can't do this from a lens of one thing. We can't look at just the vegetation. We can't look at just the birds. We can't look at just the hydrology. These are all interacting components. So how do we do this collaboratively and collectively to understand this big question? And so we got at this big questions of how do peatlands change and what are this role of time in the relationship to vegetation, stand structure, hydrology, and wildlife. And we have this amazingly cool chrono sequence across the landscape. And so everyone in the room that has helped with this, thank you, thank you, thank you, in big and small ways. But being able to look at what are we seeing in terms of the hydrology, the vegetation from trees to herbaceous species, to all the different bird species and small mammals across these different age classes and these different types, and really capturing this data collectively. And so huge, huge swaths, so many miles. And some of the pieces that we're seeing is there's a lot of similarities when we look at productive and non-productive black spruce. It's kind of cool. But tamarack is kind of doing its own thing, which also makes sense. It's a different forest type often. And so seeing this change and seeing these pieces over the landscape at these different times is really interesting to be able to see how these dynamics play out. And looking at those regeneration dynamics of who is coming in when. Wow, that looks so different on the screen compared to what it looks like on my computer. It is like neon light bright colors. But one of the pieces that is interesting is being able to see black spruce is present. Black spruce is regenerating. Black spruce is there across all these different size classes or all these different age classes. What becomes interesting is when we start to pick up tamarack, when we start to pick up these other species, doesn't happen. We can get some of these early on and then we lose them. And so I mentioned before, early intermediate treatments is a way to maintain potentially some of this diversity in the species and in the composition if we are thinking that way, or if we want that based on our goals and objectives. The other piece that's been really heartening is that in general, the water table is not changing with our forest management practices. And these are conventional systems. So these were clear cut, with minimal reserves in most of the case. And we don't see changes in the hydrology of these systems. And so the 100-year-old and the early one, so we are maintaining that below ground processes. So that is really important. And so then it comes into our harvesting practices are maintaining this water level. How do we want to think about the vegetation and that linkages to the birds? So we are maintaining the water. And when I talk to soil scientists in these systems, they're like, if you keep the water, if you keep the soil wet, the peat stays there, the carbon stays there. Great, we are doing that. Now let's talk about what's happening above ground. Okay, so I talked a lot about vegetation. I'm so excited to turn it over to Alexis to talk about the birds.
So thank you, Marcella. I mean, you guys, black spruce and tamarack, they're the coolest trees literally ever. It's so fun to hear all that. So I'm just talking about birds and the peatland systems. Again, like Marcella said, we took a holistic approach, which has been so fun for all of us. But our big question was, how does harvest impact the wildlife? And so we generally had two questions. One was to just look at overall bird diversity across those 48 sites that Marcella had put up there. And then two, we had two species in greatest conservation need that we were going to focus on. And those are boreal chickadee and Connecticut warbler. The middle one is a little baby boreal chickadee. Come on. The first piece is sort of just looking at how does the bird diversity, how do bird communities change over time in the super young stands compared to the older stands. Anyway, so we use LiDAR to look at this. This paper is in review currently, but you can see this is actually a LiDAR pull from 0 to 10, 15 to 30, 40 to 80, and then over 100-year-olds. You can see how the structure just changes from these different stands that we have. And then all of those graphs are LiDAR metrics, and essentially the structural diversity goes up as the stand gets older, which is important. But a lot of our sort of available habitat for a lot of the birds are in that sort of sustainable yield hangover where it's really homogeneous, really like typical canopy, black spruce. And of course, that is an important thing to note. Because when we look at the birds, we see that especially the habitat specialists, remember those guys I was talking about that really need those special features? There's 13 habitat specialists for peatland forests in Minnesota, 13. And they're all at the southern edge of their range as well. So they're climate threatened, but they all increase with structural diversity and with forest age. And so if we want to think about keeping these guys in Minnesota as part of our bird community, we really have to make sure that those structurally diverse forests are available for them long-term on the landscape. So, I mean, the mature forested peatlands are biodiversity hotspots, and it takes a really, really, really long time to grow a mature forested peatland, right? But we can take some of these sort of middle-aged forests and do some intermediate management techniques to try and create some of that structural diversity if we really want to. I will say it doesn't take as long to cut down a forest, and so that's a big thing that is always a big component when we're talking about the temporal scale and how the birds are going to respond. And there's some of the bird species that are specialists. So just really quickly, one of the focus species was the boreal chickadee. Steve Colby, who's up there, is the boreal chickadee czar, I think, king. What did we decide? Yeah, okay. But when we started studying this guy, again, it's southern edge of the range of Minnesota. The gaps in knowledge are many, says Birds of the World. The majority of what we know came from one paper in the 1960s. Again, this is such an understudied but such a threatened ecosystem. It's wild when we started, like there's literally nothing. I would like to announce that there's 2 new boreal chickadee papers that are coming out in 2025. Thank you. Yeah, and Steve has been the leader of all of that over the past 6 years and living in the peatlands. He's okay, probably. Just kidding. But this is just a picture of the boreal chickadee boxes. We monitor the nests, we measure all the nestlings, we monitor for survival, predation, all that kind of stuff. And then we track them with radio transmitters for as long as we can, about 30 days. And so we learn a lot about their habitat use. And it turns out that after, we call it the roaring 20s, they hang out with a lot of other 20 days after the nest, the roaring 20s, they hang out with a lot of different other species that breed in the boreal forest, little juveniles, and they hang out together in the clubs, which include a lot of mistletoe areas. And so that diverse structure is a great spot for young baby birds to stay safe. So again, sort of just thinking about that context and that lens. Our other species was the Connecticut warbler. This is a species that I think is going to leave Minnesota first due to climate change. This species is really, 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 really threatened here in Minnesota and throughout its entire range. We work a lot with our Canadian buddies to try and figure out how do we do conservation for this guy. It's almost gone out of Michigan and it's pretty much gone out of Wisconsin, and there used to be a ton of them. And so Minnesota, we're watching it happen in real time. The stronghold is the Red Lake Peatlands area where we still have a lot of them, but we have to do habitat management better for them up there. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of the approaches we've been taking for that. Again, a very understudied species. We have a paper that came out in 2023 and another one that'll come out next year, just sort of detailing the conservation of this guy. So when we think about forest management and peatlands and sort of how we've approached it with a clear cut and being scared of mistletoe and the sustainable yield thing that we established in the 1960s, it's not adequate for right now for maintaining biodiversity, for regeneration, for creating resilience, for any of that stuff. And so we got to do something a little bit different. And so the rest of the talks we're going to focus on are one from my graduate student, and then Josh Bednar is going to talk about the experimental cuts that we've set up. But really the clear cutting, is something that makes the habitat not available for a very long time for these species. And so we really have to think about, are we ready and where can we prioritize the conservation of biodiversity over timber extraction, like Marcella mentioned with the triad approach. Where can we do that? How can we do that? How can we work together to do that? So I'll ask Josh to come up here. Jamie, can you help switch the... I'll just introduce Josh. Josh is our master's student in the Integrated Biological Sciences program at the University of Minnesota Duluth, and this is your second year, a master's program. But he worked in the lab before that too, and so was it your second field season?
Yes.
He's worked a lot in the peatlands too. And I will say, like Marcella mentioned, peatlands are hard to study, and so when you have to be like, do you have a blow-up raft to get to the site? You know you're doing intense field work because you have to go across the ditch, you know what I mean? So
yes, with the life vest.
with a life vest. To do forest work, it's very
Thank you. Hi everyone, thank you for listening to me talk today. I'm going to do just a quick little brief presentation on one aspect of my master thesis, looking at tree microhabitats and mature black spruce peatlands. Okay. So just a quick outline, just give a quick brief on black spruce peatlands, my project overview, what is a tree-related microhabitat, the types that I studied, a study overview, some just preliminary results looking at microhabitat abundances across species and age classes, and then just a few takeaways. So first, for my overall thesis, I'm really interested in how ecological succession really shapes forest structure, both physical structure and community structure. So to do that, I'm using LiDAR, using vegetation analyses, and using birds specifically focused on habitat specialists and what specific structures really influence their specialization. So today, just talking about one brief aspect of structure that really influences biodiversity in these sands is tree microhabitats. And for doing this, the study system is going to be black spruce peatlands, and specifically looking at productive peatlands, productive black spruce. These are the ones that are most affected by human decisions and management decisions, and the ones that host a lot of these specialist species. Such as Connecticut warblers, boreal chickadees, all-sided flycatchers. You have specialization at different successional stages, and the structures that are involved with these successional stages and natural disturbances really influence this forest. This forest is also species compositionally for overstory trees, pretty simple, but structurally is very complex. It's a forest that doesn't have like a climax species in succession, like an eastern hemlock or these other old growth species. So we really look at how messy or how complex the structure is, we'll understand the successional stage. So tree-related microhabitats, what are they? This is the textbook definition that's used as a current typology across a lot of Central and Western Europe. But essentially, it's just a microstructure that really influences a whole range of species, biodiversity, and functions from feeding, nesting, anything you can imagine within a forest. More webs than we actually know are connecting to these processes, especially in a system where catastrophic disturbance is rare. The life and death of a tree species is highly influential for biodiversity, especially for birds. When we think about third order and fourth order habitat selection, we think about where are birds nesting, where are they hunting from, where are they perching, how are they feeding, and also different strategies like caching and other behaviors that are really influenced by forest structure. This is a hardwood tree. There's not many of those in black spruce peatlands. If you follow along next year, this will be replaced with a nice black spruce tree with examples. But I just wanted to highlight when we look at these microhabitat types, the community impacts they have and how they influence community structure. For my study, I excluded epiphytic structures purely because there's a lot of epiphytic lichens in black spruce peatlands. And I didn't have the time that I wanted to give to actually identify these lichen species, where that's going to be more of a difference than actually just having an epiphytic structure on there. So I really focus on fresh exudates, which are sap runs, resin flows, fruiting bodies of fungus, tree injuries, excrescences. We think of cankers, we think of mistletoe, which was the most common one we came across in this study, cavities, and crown deadwood. A study overview. So this stems from the larger Peatlands project that you heard about today. And I just focused on the mature, old, and then I added an older subsection of 4 new sites to this study, just try to capture more of that structure that we see in older successional stages. And I excluded the region and young age classes purely just because of the lack of overstory trees that were measurable and the difficulty getting to these stands and trying to see what's a balance of time efficiency and actually having results. The age classes for the mature and old are from tree cores, that's the mean age. And for the older, that's taken from the DNR FIA data. And those trees cores are being processed by the Civil Lab currently. So next year in the winter, we'll find out the actual age of those stands. And then I mimicked the protocol from the Civil Lab, recreating 6 plots and going to the exact 6 plots in the stands that we revisited and establishing 6 new plots in the new stands. And just recorded overstory trees, looking at DBH, the decay class, another type of structure that I measured for my project, and then microhabitat forms. So just some preliminary results quick. There's a lot of black spruce and black spruce peatlands. But the thing that's really shocking, and also talk about the great change that we're seeing, is there's a lot of dead tamarack currently. Even in these really dense black spruce cover types, a third of the tamaracks were dead. And 64 of those 103 were over 20 centimeters DBH. So we're seeing a lot of large overstory trees in a big mass mortality event. We're likely to see some boost in habitat because of that for some species, but eventually that's going to drop again when we lose those important structures and associations with living large tamaracks. And then microhabitats are a lot less frequent in conifers. We knew that coming in, but they're still important in black spruce, tamaracks, and cedars. And here's the abundances across species. I focused on the 3 species that are the main cover overstory trees for this. We had 8 recorded total. And we see that black spruce hits a lot of different microhabitats, but relatively tamarack had a lot more, especially with fungus. But we see that fungus due to the mortality events, but we're likely going to see a boost in arthropod diversity associated with fungal and eating the fungus, which attracts woodpeckers, which attracts a lot of different webs within this community. And then sap flows and tree injuries being the most common for black spruce. They're very wind prone. They get hurt a lot, injured a lot from falling trees. Also want to highlight that microhabitats are important in both dead trees and alive trees. We have to think sometimes we like to organize that dead trees have a really high wildlife habitat value, which they do, but living trees also provide that value. And oftentimes living trees with structures such as cavities can have that cavity structure that lasts longer in the landscape in a living tree versus in a dead tree that's going to eventually fall down a lot quicker than a live tree. And then across age classes, for actual analyses, we won't be using age classes, we'll use actual age of the stands. But we want to highlight that in the older stands, we see more microhabitat abundance, but that it's also highly variable. It's really variable because of disturbance. This is also another way of looking at disturbances in stands. In the mature stand, 60 of the 94 tree injuries that we observed were from 2 plots within one stand. But that stand received a massive blowdown event. So we're seeing those structures and how those influences and the larger community impacts. And then just some main takeaways that conserving these different forms of microhabitats in forest management plans is going to benefit not just birds and not just plant species, but the whole community more than we know. And ways of doing this having variable attention. Trees of certain sizes, of certain age classes, of certain decay stages, or certain microhabitats are going to benefit different species. And all these species are really essential in this ecosystem and ecotype, especially when we think about habitat specialists and microrefugia. We have species such as all-sided flycatchers who are associated with early successional stages. They also really like having structures still to perch off of and hunt off of. So when we clear cut, we take away these microhabitats and take away these structures that even species that rely on those young stages of this, those like quick and like the early time after disturbance, they still rely on those structures. And then microrefugia, saving some of these species, including dying trees, is going to have these different beetles, different arthropods and fungus diversity that's going to carry on into a stand as it develops after harvest and kind of keep that whole community in together as dying trees. A tree's life cycle at every single stage supports different communities of species, and every stage is important, including the dead and dying process of a tree. And if you have any questions on this project or curious how it follows, there's my email. Contact me after the winter time with more results, definitive results on this. And I'll be presenting in the winter here at Cloquet and in February at the Wildlife Conference. I just want to thank partners and the support from the Civil Lab and from the Avian Ecology Lab and for Alexis for letting me pursue a passion project that I really appreciate. Thank you.
Awesome, thank you, Josh. Can you, yeah. Yeah, so our sort of general approaches to what is special about these? Let's characterize some of these unique habitat features that the birds seem to be responding to in these older mature forests. Josh took a really unique approach to it, but one of the next big steps was like, okay, well, what can we do silviculturally that's a little bit different? Well, a lot of it different than the clear cuts, and how does that actually impact the bird communities? How does it impact tree regeneration? And so Josh Bednar is going to come down. I called it, I think, story time with Josh on our overview slide. Josh has been working in peatland systems for about 300 years. Is that right?
So,
Had nothing to do with work.
yeah, so, Alexis mentioned we've got this long-term monitoring data set, right? And so we've got a bunch of species that have been declining in that data set. And so historically with black spruce, tamarack, we come in and clear cut those. And it was kind of from my master's work that specifically regarding Connecticut warbler that we kind of realized we had to do something different. Okay. Great, awesome. So there's been some previous work in these systems, but not a ton. Jerry Nemi did some here 20, 30 years ago. My master's work in 2013, 2014 kind of led us into a better understanding of how those local species or how breeding birds use the Lowland conifer systems. We had some species declining in our national forests. We had these forest health issues, so we're seeing tamarack being impacted by eastern larch beetle. We know climate change is going to be a threat, and so we just wanted to give land managers another tool in their toolbox. Connecticut warblers, they breed here in North America and overwinter in South America. This is going to be the star of the show. Here's the population trend for Connecticut warblers. To put it in perspective, we've seen over a 90% decline. In the early 90s, we had 50 to 60 individuals on 1,000 surveys in our national forests. I think in the last 5 years, we've maybe had 1 or 2. So it kind of puts things at how dire the situation is for this species. Both their population is in Canada, but we do have some of the highest densities in the range here in the Red Lake Peatlands area. So my master's work, kind of revealed that they are a structure specialist, which is great. It means we can potentially manage for them. They're kind of, as Steve coined it, they're kind of a Goldilocks type species where they don't like too tall trees, too short, too thick, too thin, kind of like it right in the middle, or more parkland-like. From other work we've done, boreal chickadees, this is kind of what they like and prefer. And so there's kind of an aha moment that we can kind of create this from this. So in terms of the alternative management, historically we come in and clear cut. Who's going to benefit from retaining trees in these systems? Well, we believe the majority of the bird species that are there, that pre-harvest community would benefit. Just some other benefits with these alternative cuts, just minimize the impacts of a clear cut, so have better forest connectivity. Look at things like natural regeneration. So every year I see our DNR put out advertisements for black spruce seeds. If that's going to be an issue in the future, getting access to those seeds, maybe having these stands regenerate themselves could be huge. In my master's work, I saw hydrology issues in terms of sites that had a high cattail component after they were harvested. From a cavity standpoint, I mean, if we're clear cutting these sites, taking 50 to 60 to 70 years to get back to maturity, we're losing a lot of cavity potential there. And then specifically for the species that are residents that are caching their winter food in these sites, when we're clear cutting these sites in the dead of winter, it's probably not great for their survival. So if we cut half the site, it maybe gives those species a little bit of a hope in terms of surviving. And then again, tamarack, one of my thoughts was just having that in-stand diversity. So having multiple age classes might be beneficial for tamarack. It might not prevent things like eastern orange beetle, but could be beneficial for that species. So alternative, so with Lowland conifers, historically we've clear cut them. We come in an aerial seed. This is the one take-home message that our tree retention guidelines in these systems, so black spruce and tamarack, don't really do those mature forest birds any good. If we're looking at 6 to 12 trees per acre scattered throughout a site, which we don't do, that's doing nobody any good. So we had to come up with a design that left relatively intact tracks of black spruce and tamarack. So the goal with these alternative cuts were to retain 10 to 50% of the original stand, original basal area. Look at natural regeneration, make sure the prescription was sellable. And, you could get creative with trade-offs in terms of return visits and things like that. So the three treatments that we proposed were group selection, larger strip cuts, so 100-foot strips, and shelter wood or some thinnings. And I had to laugh because when I approached the DNR back in 2015 or 2016 with this idea, DNR Forestry, I said, I want a thin black spruce on your land. And they said, son, get out of here. But with the group selections, that was kind of come from the Aiken County cuts that they were doing. And there is some benefits to each of these here. But the strip cuts, the 100-foot strips, we had done those historically or previously. And I wanted to know, is there a difference between those big strips and those small strips? But the shelter wood thinnings were the ones that we were most excited about because they were the prescription that was least likely gonna have that landscape level impact in terms of the way a clear cut would. So how Mike North up there, Charlie Tucker, Gretchen Memmel were instrumental in as being partners in helping getting this implemented on the ground. We don't have land to work with. And so when DNR Forestry said, no way, Mike and the crew up at Norris Camp up there said, we've got some land that you could potentially work on. Through this process, took like 5 years of various meetings, email threads that were 100 responses long. But finally, we just met one day on site, hammered everything out, no fists were thrown. And we got the prescription, or we got kind of what we wanted. So this is one of the sites where we're doing the experimental cuts in. So we're covering the wildlife side of this here. Marcella and her crew is doing everything from the forestry side of things, but this is a 100-acre stand up in the Norris Camp area. We've got our group selection cuts there on the left, and then our larger strips on the upper right, small strips on the lower bottom. A little bit of history about this site. We have Connecticut warbler records here prior to the harvesting. We've got boreal chickadees at the site prior to harvesting. It was very, I would say, not frustrating, but like, you don't want to go and experiment with something where you already have a good breeding bird community. But we figured we had to look at this, otherwise we were going to just continue to keep on clear cutting. So I've got a few results here I'll show briefly. These are our Connecticut warbler detections. So 2023 and 2024 are pre-harvest. So the red and yellow are pre-harvest. That big track to the left there, that's our control site. And 2025 is post-harvest. So this is the first year post-harvest. They just about got it all cut here last winter. But we had 3 records of Connecticut warblers. You can see they're using the smaller strips and the larger strips, which is great. It'll be very important to monitor this a couple of years down the road to see if they're still going to stick with it, or if this is just a 1 year or 2 year ordeal with these guys. But very positive right now for this site here. And the other site that we're working up there is similarly, it's about another 100-acre black spruce stand. You can see our group selection cuts, our thin strips, and our larger strips. We've got 2 years of post-harvest data here. 2023, the yellow dots are pre-harvest, and then the blue and red dots are both post-harvest records for Connecticut. So results tentatively look promising for these species. We did have clear cuts as well that we were monitoring, and of course, as you'd expect, no Connecticut's there at the clear cuts. So we're going to continue to monitor these sites. We've got pre-harvest vegetation data we collected. We're going to monitor these for the next few years. And then in the future, hopefully, maybe Alexis and Marcella might get together and do an LCCMR proposal where we kind of look at this a little more intensively. That said, these cuts can be implemented anywhere. If it wasn't for our partnership with the DNR wildlife folks, this probably still wouldn't have happened. So thanks to those, a lot of mature forest species will benefit. The other thing to think about is consider site index. I don't think we're harvesting site indices, in the 20s, but the lower the site index goes, we should probably question whether we should be harvesting those sites or not. And unlike aspen, these trees take a long time to develop into cavity potentials. Great.
If we have Maya, is it Swope?
Swope.
Swope?
Yeah.
She's from the Nature Conservancy. She's going to talk about the Peatlands Playbook.
Yeah.
Here it is. So that one worked. That was
Great.
weird. Let me share the screen. Quick.
Yeah, and while that gets set up, yes, I'm Maya Swope. I'm a climate project manager with the Nature Conservancy. So I work for our Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota chapter, but mostly focused in Minnesota. And I'm going to be talking about some of our work at TNC to protect and restore peatlands. So when I say peatlands, I'm thinking about all of the lowland conifer areas that folks have been talking about today. And then with the addition of some of our more like open peatland areas that are, shrubby or sedge vegetation as well.
Okay.
Is that good? Okay. Okay, so I probably don't have to give too much background, but if you work in peatlands, a fact that you've probably heard is that they cover about 3% of the Earth's surface, but store 30% of our terrestrial soil carbon. And that's really where our work at the Nature Conservancy is focused. So while we're kind of partnering with researchers to talk about forests, trees, and vegetation in general, most of our work is focused on the hydrology management and then on understanding the carbon and other greenhouse gas dynamics in these peatland systems. And again, I'm not an ornithologist, but I couldn't miss an opportunity to put my blurry owl photos in the presentation. So these are taken up in the Saxon Bog area. So maybe tomorrow you'll get to see a great gray if you're lucky. But yeah, just to highlight, these peatland systems, as you all know by now, are great for bird habitat for a variety of species. So peatlands are, in addition to the lowland conifers, there's a lot of other types of peatlands. This is kind of where you'll find them across Minnesota. There are a few that I cut off of the bottom in southern Minnesota, but I wanted to focus on zooming in on some of these ones in northern Minnesota here. And just to highlight, you know, that if you've driven through northern Minnesota, you've driven by a peatland. So at the Nature Conservancy, we've been working on peatlands for a little over 3 years. And I wanted to share about this peatland playbook that we published about a year ago or last winter. So this is a document. I have the like executive summary here today, and then you can also download it at this website if you're interested. But it kind of details, you know, where are the peatlands in Minnesota? What's their condition? What do we know about, you know, how we might go about restoring them, and what has been attempted so far in terms of different restoration or protection opportunities. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of the things that are in this playbook here today, but encourage you, if you're interested in like the hydrology, especially, to go and read that. I'll talk a little bit about like intact and drain peatlands, and really when I'm thinking about that, what I'm talking about is drainage ditches. So we can see that a intact or healthy peatland has a water table that's pretty close to the surface. We think of it like a sponge, both for carbon and for water. So the carbon is kind of locked away, stored pretty well under the ground and under the water table, and can, you know, function like a healthy wetland and absorb waters when there's flooding or something like that. However, in Minnesota, a lot of our peatlands have drainage ditches dug through them. So, you know, over the last 100+ years, people, you know, came to this part of Minnesota, said, I'm going to farm here, dug some drainage ditches, and then soon discovered it was not a great place to do farming. But the ditches are still there for the most part. So when we have these ditches dug, it dramatically increases the carbon dioxide emissions, lowers the water table, also just means that the water table is going to fluctuate a lot more based on precipitation. And so that really dries out the peatland. We see a lot of emissions, but can also lead to changes in the plant communities, biodiversity, habitat. So often near a ditch where it's dried out, we'll see like an encroachment of some more upland type of species. Also just wanted to note that intact peatlands are enhancing climate change resilience. So Marcella noted that there is not a lot of research on peatlands. There's a little bit more research on like some of the Northern European peatlands, but in Minnesota and kind of Southern Canada, there's not nearly as much research. But we do there's like some consensus building that they do provide that water storage capacity, buffering against both flooding and drought, which is important, obviously, in a climate change era, and can also act as fire refugia, so preventing carbon loss from wildfires. So that's when they're kind of intact, when we see the hydrology functioning as it should be. So part of what we've been thinking a lot about at the Nature Conservancy is, you know, what are our actual strategies for peatland conservation? So we've divided it into kind of these 3 pillars, I guess. So the first and maybe most ideal would be to protect intact peatlands. That's obviously going to be like a better result, more cost efficient, and a good idea where you can do that. We also have all of these peatlands across the state that have drainage ditches dug through them, but have not been like fully converted. So they're not like fully developed. They're not in agriculture. They're not, you know, don't have pavement on them. And that's really where we're focusing most of our work right now. We also see in the future, hopefully maybe somebody else can tackle this, but there are a lot of peatlands across the state that have been fully converted. So places where there are peat soils, or where there used to be peatlands that are now kind of in heavy agricultural use, that are emitting a lot of carbon because of their peatland soils. So restoration there would also be beneficial. So this map is kind of showing the intersection of both where there are peatlands and where there are still active drainage ditches in Minnesota. You can see in the circle are kind of the areas with the highest concentration of that. So one of those areas is right around here and just a little bit north. And then the other is where some of these other presentations were taking place, north of Red Lake, in those Red Lake peatland areas. And I think Marcella mentioned this as well, but more than half of our total peatland soils are on state, federal, or county public lands. Okay, this is a lot of numbers, so you don't need to look at it too closely, but I just wanted to show kind of, so this is how peatlands are spread across the state. We can see that the majority of them are on our state lands, and then we've split it out kind of by designation of what type of state lands they're on. And we can also see that that is true with the peatlands that are ditched. So peatlands that have drainage ditches through them, but still have some peatland characteristics, maybe peat vegetation. We also see a large chunk of those on state lands too. But there's lots of other lands to consider as well. So we've been talking a lot about, wanting to do peatland restoration. So these are a few of the things that we think about in terms of, how to restore peatland. What are the factors we need to consider? Sorry, it's a little cut off at the bottom. But starting with the biophysical. So at the very, very basic level, restoring peatland often just means plugging a ditch. So we want the water to stay on site. We want it to, spread out and soak into the landscape. So that can often start by plugging a ditch. Sometimes there's other water management that needs to happen, depending on the size of your watershed, things like that. We also see that in some peatlands, there's a need for vegetation restoration. So that might look like reseeding sphagnum moss, something like that. But in some peatlands, there's enough vegetation on site or nearby that it can kind of recover itself once you bring the hydrology back to something that's a little bit more natural. There's also a lot of economic barriers or economic considerations that we talk about. The state right now does have some federal grants for peatland restoration. So the DNR has a grant for like a pilot project. There's also going to be $4 million going to tribal nations for peatland restoration. And then we're also working with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. They have some money for peatland restoration north of Red Lake as well. So we're seeing some incoming money. Hopefully that all will stay the case, that those projects can go through. But that's exciting because we've been talking about peatland restoration, and now in the past couple of years are really seeing some steps forward to make that be able to happen. Bowser also has a peatland program for private land. And we're starting to think about if carbon markets might be an option for getting some more projects. That's sort of we're thinking about that. We've done some initial studies, but nothing is moving forward too fast on that right now. So in addition to those biophysical and economic factors, also a number of sociopolitical factors. One of those things is just like drainage mindset. I think, when a lot of our peatlands were drained, there was like this need to get the water out. We want to drain the swamp, get it off the landscape. And a lot of things have changed since then, but some of that mindset, I think, still sticks around. One of the things that folks run into if they want to implement a peatland restoration project is just landowners nearby feeling really wary of plugging drainage ditches. And even if it wouldn't necessarily affect their land, there's a lot of nervousness about it. We also run into, just because a lot of the peatlands are on state land or federal land, a lot of the designations, a lot of the peatlands are in school trust lands. So there are other goals on those lands, like revenue generation or other things that can make it difficult to do a peatland restoration project. So this kind of brings me to like, what is the work that the Nature Conservancy is actually doing to move this forward? So we have a peatland scientist, you can see in the top photo there, Mark. So he is doing field research. He's done 2 full seasons so far, actually, in this area, in the Saxon Bog landscape. He's trying to measure the impact of peatland restoration on greenhouse gas emissions. So he has 3 different sites. He has a site that has been drained. He has a site that has been drained and then restored. And then he has an intact peatland site. And he's comparing the carbon dioxide and methane and vegetation and some other factors at those sites, just to try to get a sense of like, okay, we know that restoration is good, but what are some of the factors that, can help us get there? And also like, what are the specifics that we need to know to, make a good restoration project in terms of soils, vegetation communities, thinking about the ditches. And then that research also is a collaboration with University of Minnesota. Chris Lenhart is doing some research. I think he's in, I don't know what department he's in. I'm not super familiar with U of M. And then we have partners at Michigan Tech and US Forest Service as well. So then we're also trying to connect that. So, we have this growing body of science, trying to connect that into actual support for partners with implementation. So we're trying to provide technical assistance where we can. We're also working with the US Forest Service to create a peatland restoration guide. So if that all goes smoothly, sometime next year, there will be a guide for practitioners. So anyone who's managing land to say, okay, here's what my landscape looks like. Where do I start? What permits do I need? What things do I need to think about? So we're trying to compile that into a guide for the hydrologic restoration. We also are working on building up our network. So peatland restoration is kind of new in Minnesota, and there's a lot of questions about what are the best ways to do it, who's working on what knowledge do we need. So we're just trying to compile all of that. We have a series of working groups that the call is open to anyone if you want to join. One of them is focused on policy. So, do we need to update ditch laws? Do we need to change how different state lands are run or things like that to be able to support peatland restoration? We have a working group that is focused on creating this restoration guide. And we also have one that is for any practitioner on the ground. So anyone who is thinking about implementing a restoration project or is currently doing one to be able to, share advice back and forth. And then we, from time to time, host a bunch of workshops, webinars, etc. So that was a very quick overview. I have a few copies of our executive summary of our Peatland playbook. They're up there, but I can bring them down to this table. But feel free to email me if you want more information or if you want to get involved in any of those groups that I've mentioned. And I also just wanted to put in the plug that we got some funding to do a convening generally on like the combination of peatlands plus wildfire plus lowland conifers. So stay tuned for that coming sometime this spring. Hopefully some of you will be there, and we're hoping to gather just some experts to have a discussion about management around those topics. So that's it. Yeah.
Up next, we have Mike Lynch and Matt Widen, and they are going to talk about black spruce utilization or the economics of black spruce. So, anyway.
All right, thanks everyone. So Alexis and Marcella mentioned earlier that they've known each other for years and did a great job having a seamless presentation together. Matt and I met each other during the break. So if there's some herky-jerkiness, bear with us. So we just went over, we essentially had two presentations during the break. We seamed them together. It's going to be not seamless, but so we'll go from there. So I'm Mike Lynch, work for the Forest Stewards Guild.
Yeah, I'm Matt Widen. I'm with Minnesota Forest Industries.
Okay, and I didn't have a lot of black spruce pictures, so you got a couple of them in here, but all right, you want to talk about?
Yeah, so Minnesota Forest Industries, I'm sure a lot of you know who they are. These are our member groups up there. They produce all of Minnesota's wood, fiber, and timber products. A lot of the ones that we're going to mention today are more in the pulp and paper, and that's going to be PCA and SAPI, UPM, but also they do saw as well. So that's going to be potlatch and headstrom. So, I mean, we're going to talk about how important black spruce is to the industry in Minnesota.
All right. And I just have a brief slide saying I work for the Forest Stewards Guild, and we have a vision and a mission. I said put it. So anyway, here's a picture. As I was mentioning to people earlier, black spruce lives in a variety of habitats, but actually not that many habitats, but in a variety of forms. So here's just a picture of, like this is your like 300-year-old black spruce probably or something, right? So ranging from a lot of what this stuff, the utilization side of things we'll be talking about, is more in the I have that many pictures to choose from, but so just imagine those weren't like jack pines in the background, but that was like a slightly richer black spruce forest. So they do range from right in these very acidic peatland sites to the more productive forest types. And I thought it was a cool picture. That's basically why I put it in. So what we're going to be pulling from is a lot of the same stuff. Actually, Marcella had was from the June 2025 published version of the Minnesota's Forest Resources. This is the data through 2023 that they just put out. There was a couple year gaps. If you'll notice in the data that we have here, there'll be, I don't know what it typically starts. That'd be like 98 through 2019. They didn't have this data in 2020 and 2021. So you'll kind of pick that up here. You're the industry guy. You can maybe explain this a little bit, but basically here's our chart coming through of the utilization in the different lumber, OSB, pulp and paper, wood and energy from 96 through 2023. The dip in the blue line.
Yeah, so that's mostly attributed to, we lost Verso. That was a big one. So that was probably the major reason for that. And then in the green, you'll see, pulp and paper has decreased a little bit. Things are going digital. We're not using paper as much, but still extremely important to the industry.
And then the OSB, we lost, I don't know what it was, 4 or 5 mills.
Yep.
In around like the housing market crash time period, so about 08, a bunch of those closed up, and that's what dropped the OSB market down. I think there's just 2 OSB mills left in the state and
Yep.
2 harbors and
then there's in Bemidji area.
Bemidji.
Yep. So
that's a change there. Again, this is the 2023 data, so you can kind of see the spread of what is utilized in the state. And black spruce.
Yep. So black spruce, you can see we're kind of on the southern edge of it, but black spruce is awesome because it's so widely distributed. It has a huge range. It's, it's really, really common, and we're lucky to kind of have a slice of the pie, but it is one of the largest forest types in North America. Really, really cool.
And zooming into Minnesota, of course, it looks black on here, so I went and quick changed all of the text during the break from white or from black to white, so it would show up better. And then anyway, so bear with us here, but you can kind of still see it. So this is the black spruce cover type and the white spruce cover type kind of heat map. So you can see spruce certainly in the arrowhead, both types, and then kind of spread throughout. The next slide, I think, talks about so Marcella had this, the 2 of us developed presentations independently. We also had this same slide, so kind of a convergence of ideas here, but there's the big picture. So you can see 9% of the cover types according to the DNR's classification system in black spruce. In that, pulling out that other, then you have white spruce circled over there, 1% there. So certainly of the cover type, black spruce is a lot larger component of Minnesota's forests. And one thing just to mention, I think, I can't read it at all, but so if you see in the acreage, so the black spruce cover type, 1.39 million acres, white spruce is more in the 137,000 acres. I don't know. Can you see that at all, or should I just quick change these to black? All right. Hold on a second. We'll just try and undo this. You want to talk? You can still see this figure. You can show the distribution.
Yeah. So,
no, you can't now.
yeah. One thing I was finding really interesting about that graph, you can see that a lot of the age class was kind of all in the center from that 60 to 100-year-old age class. And there could be a lot of reasons for that it was maybe all cut, in that time period, early mid 1900s. And then you see that it kind of tapers off on each side. So we're not seeing a lot of young black spruce, and there isn't a lot of old either. So it seems like we're lacking actually the diverse age class of spruce. And there could be a lot of reasons for that. One, because, we're not cutting as heavily as we used to. So you could kind of see it's all kind of in that middle age class. So we're not overcutting it. I mean, a lot of it is aging.
You want to just
You know, there's argument that we're even lacking that younger age class. So, hopefully that alleviates some concerns that the industry is just out there to just go get it all. It just doesn't work like that. So.
Yeah, and
Sorry,
no, that's good.
went as fast as I can.
Instead of changing everything back to black, we're just gonna, I don't know why it flips between these. A couple of the things I just added for a bunch of text, because I thought people just wanted to sit here and read things. The black spruce, so keeping in mind that these cover types that I mentioned earlier, that 1.39 million, so 30% of the volume of black spruce is in other cover types. Whereas 71% of the white spruce trees on the landscape are in cover types not classified as white spruce. So just kind of highlighting that just because it shows those acreages, that doesn't mean the only thing. Did you mention, I wasn't even listening actually, the breakdown how state has 51%?
Oh, I did not.
Of
I did not.
the black spruce cover type. So certainly a lot on state land there.
Let's just do it the old fashioned way here. All right, that's your slide. Why don't you
Yep.
get that one?
So one reason that black spruce, a few reasons that it's so important to the industry is that black spruce has some really unique qualities. The main one being that it has really, really long fibers. The wood has really long fibers. And those fibers are really good for very specific types of paper and pulp products. Other species don't have fibers like that. So they really fulfill a very unique role in forest products, like your high-end paper products specifically, which kind of UPM and Grand Rapids really, really specializes in. So it's really important to them. Also, loggers really benefit and really enjoy working in black spruce because since often they're low, they're very level, which means that it's easier to manage or to operate in. It's flat, they're using less fuel, less emissions, they're less maintenance on their equipment because they're not traversing difficult terrain. Really, really, really good sites for as far as an operability standpoint. And they're also really high volume per acre, which means they could get the same amount of volume while harvesting less acres, which is really, really nice. Less forwarding, you don't have to travel as far to get to the outer reaches of the sale. So timber sale design, black spruce is just, it's a dream in some ways. And they're also very tall, they're very straight, which is ideal for sawing and hauling and and just basically handling throughout the operations. So black spruce just really have a lot of really great qualities as far as timber management goes. They really do. So each year, this is about an estimate. So there is some issues with when you're figuring out how much is black spruce, how much is white spruce. Sometimes they get mixed, but on average, looks like we're using about 80,000 cords a year. Usually it sells to the logger for about $22, $23 a cord, which means public agencies get about 1.8 million, which is like the DNR, the Forest Service, counties. The 5-year average, so what a logger would pay, it's usually worth about $97 a cord, which, so 2-year logger in these areas where there's black spruce, that's about 7.7 million annually to, your loggers, your truckers, and your operators. So that is very important because, industry, it's, you've seen a taper in years, and keeping operators operating in these hard sell areas, which is typically where spruce is more important than ever. It really is.
Okay, you saw this same table an hour ago, so if you forgot, here it is again. But in terms of pulpwood, you see circled spruce there again, as I wrote in that slide earlier, but you couldn't see it. So typically they're going to report black spruce and white spruce together, but a lot of it is black spruce. So 95,000 there is the second highest number in the pulpwood numbers. If you're looking at in terms of volume on the pulpwood market in Minnesota, miles behind the 1.2 up top for aspen, but certainly an important component. And I think it maybe says somewhere in here, but what I was seeing at least is some of these have a mix of about 15% softwood and 85% aspen is kind of how they're mixing some of these together. Okay. Let's go here. Pulpwood, data missing for 2020 and 21. You can see in the bottom, certainly dropping off from 15 to 23. That's a pretty substantial drop in spruce on the far column, which is hard to cut off, but 243 down to 95. A lot of that is due to the Verso mill here in Duluth, well, not here, but adjacent to here in Duluth, shuttering in 2020, which was a big user. They now, I think, make toilet paper or something, tissue paper.
Yeah,
They don't,
recycled.
and they use recycled paper, so they don't, they're not pulling in any forest products anymore. Parallel to the drop in pulp usage has been a slight increase in saw timber usage. And so certainly in other parts of the world, sawed more up in Canada and things like that. Here, sounds like Headstrom's probably the main one, or you said Potlatch takes some?
Potlatch takes some as well, but yeah, Headstrom, yep.
Typically a small diameter, but straight, long, known for durability, lightweight, dimensional stability as lumber. So certainly when the sizes are right, has some good usage there. Here's again another one of these versions of, you can see the softwood species trends. Marcella had this one, you had this one. Basically everybody pulled this figure in, but again, you can see where that star is. That's the year that the Verso plant here in Duluth closed. So of course the spruce market is going to drop the utilization is going to drop off pretty substantially, given the change in locations it can go to. Did you want to mention this, or me too? Basically, this is
Yeah, go ahead. I didn't see this one.
so this was one out of that same DNR report looking at the sustainable yield of timber, utilization between kind of the yield and what is actually harvested. So you can see with jack and red pine, kind of lockstep. Spruce and fir, a much different story, a lot less of the yielded spruce is getting harvested. This one, I know I just figured we'd throw in a little bit of a wordy, complicated slide to you, but 3 main pulp mills in Minnesota. Sappi here in Minnesota, in Cloquet, no spruce at all, is at least what I'm reading there. My understanding is no spruce at Sappi. But then PCA up in International Falls, and certainly Blandon and Grand Rapids, those are significant portions of what they're utilizing. I don't know if you've got any.
Yeah, yep. Like I said, and those pulp mills were, what they really need is those long fibers of spruce. And you can use balsam and white spruce as well, but they're such a smaller component on the landscape that black spruce really is the driver behind those products.
Yeah, so the asterisk is just for reference, the minor amount. So at that UPM blend, and balsam fir, spruce are the kind of primary wood they're taking there to make that magazine paper. And that was a similar story at the Verso mill here in Duluth prior to its sale and conversion to whatever kind of tissue paper they make now. Let's see what else I had. Oh yeah, that's that 85-15% breakdown. 80% of the pulpwood consumed at these 3 mills is coming from Minnesota. There is certainly some, especially at the Sappi one being as close as it is to the Wisconsin border. Some percentage, well, maybe 18%, is coming in from outside of the state. Just another image from that same DNR report, highlighting that the harvest removals, state versus federal, I thought was an interesting comparison here. on this image. So the state is removing a lot more, although they certainly had more. So that's what made this figure not quite as, I don't know. Seemed like the state said it had 51% of the forest type, and this didn't seem to line up to that same thing, but interesting that the state removals are a lot higher than they're showing federal removals. Any interest in going over these summary points, or I can hit them?
No, go ahead. Yeah, your slide. Take it.
So a couple of the summary points about essentially the highlight, right? We talked earlier today of like what's going on with black spruce and lowland conifers in general. What are some of the changes? Could lead person to say, well, you know, what are we harvesting black spruce for at all? Well, it is very important to a couple of these mills and some of the products developed here in Minnesota. You had that slide talking about some of the economic impacts. Some of the things put in here, there's this little talking thing ahead of there, but spruce second largest by volume, pulpwood in the state, so certainly an important component there. Valued for those long fibers, and really one of the ways someone was explaining this to me was originally when they started making paper here in Minnesota, they were using a lot more spruce. It was a heavy spruce component. And during that time, the aspen was largely a, what are we going to do with this? It was kind of something on the landscape. Over time, learned, and I might be totally wrong on this. This is me interpreting from people telling me this stuff. Essentially, they figured out that they could still build using those long fibers to basically build the framework, the structure for the paper. And then the aspen can kind of fill in the matrix inside there. And so historically, spruce was a much larger component of even the like the International Falls kind of printer paper components. Now they're able to mix in a lot more aspen, and that's opened up that change on the landscape to being able to utilize more aspen. So nice fiber, certainly declined in use and such over the last few years with the Verso mill here in Duluth closure. By far and away, the main utilization of black spruce is pulp with some saw timber components. We know we had a few people here from Wisconsin, so I pulled the same report from Wisconsin or similar report that Wisconsin does. There's the most recent one I found was, well, I don't even know, I didn't put the front. It was like 22 or something like that. But you can see, or you can't see actually, especially if you're in the back, but you can imagine the volumes go from highest to lowest, and you can at least see the red rectangle, which is spruce. Closer to the lowest than the highest part of here. So aspen, red pine, red maple, red oak, etc. on the top. But whereas spruce was in Minnesota, second in pulpwood, I think fourth in overall utilization. The story is very different in Wisconsin. Now there's different spruce, black spruce resources in Wisconsin, a lot less of these big bogs that we have in northern Minnesota, etc. But just for those of you in Wisconsin, it's a much minor component of the state and certainly of the utilization in that state. Also, I got you a second for the Wisconsin folks. You got two slides. Same thing. This is the pulpwood breakdown. So even in pulpwood, far from that second. Interestingly, in Wisconsin, the pulpwood soft maple is of 20, what year this was, 2018. Soft maple outpaced aspen, which is not the story here in Minnesota, but soft maple outpaced aspen in terms of pulpwood utilization in Wisconsin. I don't even know what this figure is.
Oh, okay. No, so they talked about dwarf mistletoe earlier, and I love that the fact that she brought up about how it can bring diversity. It's a natural thing, but also kind of contributing to that is that usually hits at older ages. You know, it's usually what this shows is that you just typically don't see that mistletoe until it gets really old, 100 to 120. And that's actually how a lot of stand rotations when you're harvesting black spruce, it is set. It is long rotation because it just grows so slow. It's not going to be merchantable until it's big like that. So this also comes into a play in why, there is some benefit, but again, like she said, it is a natural process. But you do end up seeing, once you get into that really old forest type, that is where mistletoe may start to have more impact on the forest.
And one thing I wanted to throw up here was just to highlight that, some of these different approaches we're talking about here today, and probably why Josh said he was the least popular person for the whole of deer. That's crazy. That'd be an amazing accomplishment. So here's the 2019 updated 2019 Black Spruce Timber Sale guidelines that the DNR sends out to their foresters, and they have in there the 5-foot cutting rule. So this is basically what the DNR is using on their properties. Employ 5-foot cut and kill everything over 5 feet in a black spruce timber sale. And so in there it talks about basically mistletoe being the primary justification for that. And it needs to be utilized, these are texts that pulled out of there, unless the stand is confirmed free of dwarf mistletoe. All timber sales must require the 5-foot cutting rule. And even the level to confirm that it doesn't have mistletoe seemed rather rigorous as well. So basically on the DNR lands, this is at least DNR forestry. I suppose I should stipulate that might be different on the wildlife lands, but on DNR forestry, this is their baseline thing. And we got some budworm.
Yep. So I'm from Two Harbors. That's where I've been a forester for the DNR for a while before I was with Minnesota Forest Industries. And when I was a forester and even as a private landowner, one of my biggest concerns is budworm. And budworm, it does target balsam and white spruce much more than black spruce, which is really nice because the black spruce had much higher survival rate than the other spruce and balsam species. And that has created a lot of issues. One, for timber sale merchantability, because we had a lot of mortality, so it's hard to actually manage those stands. And two, it actually makes black spruce even more important because those long fibers that you also see in white spruce and balsam, we lost a lot of that on the landscape because of budworm, which means a lot of the remaining, fiber that we require comes from spruce, black spruce, because we lost those other components, a lot of it from budworm. And with that, we've had an insane amount of fires. So I've been evacuated from my house. I've been evacuated from my friends have been evacuated. So I know this very well. And because of, the budworm, because of larch beetle, there's so many things going on. Being able to manage our forests is really, really important these days. And also just the aging of our forest, because we haven't been able to manage a lot of our spruce stuff because of markets. And also because our winters have been less predictable, it's harder to get into these places. It's been a battle in the Northeast. It really has. And a lot of my time has been devoted to figuring out what to do about this. It's been a tough one, but so being able to manage these stands, especially around populated areas, has been increasingly important.
And I think that's about all we had for this group. So, hopefully you figured out where the black spruce goes. That's
Stay up there. The other presenters want to come up. We're going to do a Q&A for about 20 minutes before lunch. I'll pull up the Slido so you guys can be anonymous or you can raise your hand. I did see there was a Zoom question. Zoom folks, please. Well, we got you on the screen, so if you want to show your video, go on mute, please do so. There was a question from Jake Meyer. Why is there such a big difference in the size between county and state?
I'm assuming that's between difference in maybe clear cut sizes or that patch size. And again, some of that is what we're picking up. Like even some folks might have seen like the large size of like private, like industrial land. That was, some of that was also related to research, which was like a big landscape level clear cut for looking at a range of different conditions within that clear cut. But in terms of county versus state land, a lot of that comes down to honestly, the disturbance level that they're responding to. So being able to have, depending on where those sites are and where in the county a disturbance fell, where in the state a disturbance fell, we pick that up. So basically that is what we are seeing there in terms of like disturbance level that we picked up and the response to that disturbance level. So I wouldn't say like this is kind of standard or conventional, even though we're now seeing disturbances like these more and more frequently. And so I think that is something we need to consider is like how our October ice storms that impacted a large area or our May frost or anything else, like those then relate to the decisions of how do we move forward to maintain healthy forests, and especially forests that have policy requirements related to school trust, how to make sure that policy is being maintained on forests that are impacted by large scale disturbances.
Any other questions?
Yes.
Do they have to type them in or can they raise their hand?
Oh, yeah, you can raise. Someone just asked if they could do a verbal. Yes, please do.
Give enough charter to stand your question.
Yeah, go for it. Go for it.
We gotta have those teams too.
Well, my question was, John Allmendinger, who was the retired resource assessment leader for the DNR Forestry Resource Assessment Program, had often commented to certain audiences that a lot of black spruce stands have been lost due to swamping or being converted to brushlands. Yeah, Marcella, you got a slide that showed that it looked like hydrology didn't really change with harvest type. Is there a discrepancy there at all, or do you have an explanation for why that might be a discrepancy?
I think this is almost a team answer with Maya and I. And so like what we're looking at is stands that are black spruce now. That doesn't mean historically we didn't lose those stands. And I think folks that drive around northern Minnesota can very much see the impact of ditching and land conversion and everything like that. I mean, there's some really iconic roads where you're like, that looks like a great healthy forest. And that looks like it used to be a healthy forest. And there's a road there now. So we definitely can see that visually. But in the forest that we have, and from our study locations, we are not seeing that. So I think that's one of the pieces that is a concern and has been a concern is like, if we do a clear cut regeneration harvest, are we getting drier or wetter? And we're not seeing either. We're seeing like, okay, we're maintaining that and that notes good forestry practices current. Then I can pass it to Maya.
I don't know if I have much to add, but yeah, just I guess to underscore, like, we're seeing the impacts of like the, 100+ years of drainage. But I think you answered it as well as I could.
Very good question. Yeah.
I think I saw that discrepancy too. I think, someone said that keeping the water keeps the peatlands, but then I think, Josh, you said you've actually seen some swamping out, so.
Yeah, so like a lot of cattail and stuff like that, and maybe the stands have recovered, but that was just one thing I noted that. You know, this is how we're managing them, this probably isn't super great, but maybe it's just a few sites that also.
So I know it's kind of early in the game for some of like your research, Josh. And we heard a lot about dwarf mistletoe and what the impacts are, and maybe, you know, it can lead to more diversity in stands. Is there some sort of like management takeaway where we can meet at an intersection of, okay, so for management for forest species retaining biodiversity and some habitat for species like Connecticut warbler or boreal chickadee, we're retaining a little bit more, but we want to mitigate some of the effects of dwarf mistletoe in these stands. So things like the voluntary site level guidelines, are those just from a management perspective, can we be using them? Maybe they don't use them on DNR lands all the time, but there's still 49% of our black spruce. What type of retention can we be actually managing for in those stands? when it's allowed, that has habitat benefits and mitigates some of the effects of, forest health issues.
Yeah, and I will note, like, DNR forestry is using the guidelines. There is a forest health exemption status that dwarf mist falls under. And so making sure that piece of like DNR is meeting those. And like, we are a lucky state that our guidelines are voluntary. Not all states have voluntary guidelines. And I think that gives us a lot of power to respond to changes and implement changes when we need to them. From like our research, I don't think we have to be afraid of residuals in black spruce. I don't think we have to be afraid of them. I think they have a lot of opportunity. And also, like, we've seen volumes, we've talked about volumes. Individual black spruce, this is not like one individual black spruce. This is not like the same as an individual oak or red pine or anything like that. What individual black spruce or clumps of black spruce, this is not gonna make or break a sale. But those could be great long-term habitat and future coarse-woody debris or anything like that. So I think there's more opportunity. And I will put a caveat, also a lot of opportunity for research of like, if we leave some residuals, what is the percent chance that those residuals have enough seed to regenerate our stand without aerial seeding within our 5-year window? So like, we're now getting into that policy of if we do a regeneration check, we need to secure regeneration that is free to grow within 5 years. And so how can we use the trees that are there and use that chance to reduce the need for seed and be able to kind of link these pieces together with habitat and opportunities there?
Thank you.
Eric.
Yeah, you know, coarse-woody debris. So retaining coarse-woody debris is kind of like a focus of ecological forestry. And I think someone mentioned that below downs are a common natural disturbance in these stands. So what is the importance of increasing coarse-woody debris or tree regeneration? That might be different than say like where you over Wisconsin be yellow birch that almost need these tip up mounds and that sort of thing. What would be important in a Lowland conifer stand or tree? And then on top of that, like with bird microhabitats, I know you looked at probably standing snags or standing trees, but what importance can that provide for say birds foraging? So I guess maybe take part question.
Okay, so from the coarse-woody debris and then tree regeneration, lots of still unknowns in that question mark. Like, what are those relationships? How does that show up on the landscape? And what is that microtopography? So we know these are not big trees, but it's amazing how one of them can kind of create swampiness. Like when one falls down, it's creating this pocket. And so what is happening in that pocket versus the upland kind of hummock? So hummocks versus hollows, we know are important. But what that actually looks like in terms of that regeneration dynamics long term, or even securing advanced regeneration, it's a great question.
I'll just add, does anyone have the Native Plant Community Guidebook here? I don't have mine, but if you read the section on like the forested rich peatlands, or whichever type these are, I can't remember, but it talks about how infrequent disturbance, at least in the Allmendinger work, was like, I forget, maybe Christian and I talked about this at one point, like 1,000-year fire and wind throw even being extremely rare, except in, essentially if some of them get removed, then wind throw can happen pretty regular. But disturbance, it seems like, is very rare, aside from mistletoe and things like that, in these systems. And that may actually end up leading to why some of these birds are as susceptible to management, is they're birds that adapted in a system that didn't have disturbance typically to it.
Yeah, it was really this system, especially with like the rare frequency of catastrophic disturbance and a lot of like forests, it's really shaped by those secondary smaller disturbances. Like you think of like herbivory, we've got a single tree death and creating those canopy gaps. And that's really driving the complexity in structure. You can imagine when you have times in 500 years, how many different age cohorts of trees, how many different types of disturbance they're like experiencing, just that structural differences between where you have an older forest, it's gonna have traits of multiple successional stages due to the secondary disturbances. And then your question with the coarse weed debris, from my side, I excluded it purely because sphagnum likes to really cover pulling trees pretty quickly. But the value of tip ups is definitely, it definitely has a value. You see more blowdown, you start hearing winter wrens, you start hearing other birds that really rely on those complex structures and stands.
Yeah, so I mean, for a lot of these focal species, we really don't see them in these sites until we start getting that structural complexity or that diversity. And so, I mean, when we're looking at sites and potentially retaining trees, you know, clear cutting it or removes that habitat off the landscape for 40, 50, 60 years, where if we can kind of have that constant supply and that clump of residuals there, that would be better for a lot of those species. The other thing we'll say is that in addition to the birds, we're doing small mammals, amphibians and things like that as well on these experimental cuts. As far as the coarse woody debris goes, I don't know. We've done a lot of nesting studies here in the last few years, and it's a dog-eat-dog world out there in terms of like predators and nest success and things like that. So I think that's another area that we can maybe focus in a little bit more and just see the impacts of coarse woody debris, especially in those black systems.
I'm gonna say she's looking, but maybe.
For Matt and Mike, what percent of our current, black spruce demand can now or in the near future be met from a secondary forest, secondary black spruce stand? Instead of the primary ones.
Good question. That's, I don't have an answer to that off the top of my head, to be honest, to tell you the truth. Yeah, I don't know. I don't have that data, unfortunately. Yeah. Good question.
I just wanted to kind of comment on Peter's question from earlier, especially, I'm really glad you guys have the research showing some of these alternative harvest management options. And it's something, as land manager, having some of the frustrations to actually be able to implement that. I just touched on a lot of these Lowland conifers are on, state land and county land, and particularly for state land, a lot of that, especially up in Cushing County, part of my work area is on school trust land. So, and for those of you that aren't aware, there are certain policies and statutes that limit what we're able to do, and especially on school trust land, it's like a 5% reserve is the absolute maximum. So that definitely limits some of the ability to do some of those alternative management practices and similar type of management restrictions on county land, where they're also very, profit driven, or not necessarily profit driven, but economically driven, that, offset the tax base. So we're getting the challenges from the legal and statutory side, and also, as you mentioned, from the operability side, with our warmer winters, and, sometimes takes, 5 or 6 years for a logger to be able to go in and harvest a stand. So oftentimes we're seeing the field as they might buy 5 or 6 different adjoining stands, wait for the one good winter, and then clear cut 400 or 500 acres all at once. And so, I guess, it's not just to kind of expand on that question, but it's like, from the operability side of things, and also the legal statutory side of things, and if you have suggestions on how going forward, us land managers might have some options to maybe try and employ some more bird habitat friendly practices. Hard question, sorry.
The one thing I'll say is that there seems to be some opportunity there with pairing it with something that's really more merchantable than implementing more of your the criteria that you want. So I think try to be creative that way, but it is a problem, right? Because these are voluntary guidelines. And so I don't know, I don't have a good answer in terms of all the voluntary side of things, but it just seems like pairing it up with some sort of aspen site, or not that that's what you want to do, but I think that might be creative that way.
I would see this right as an opportunity, right? That's a large disturbance, and those are part of our landscape too. So large scale disturbances are important and also provide habitat.
that then is like the struggle of like, with the multiple owners and multiple ownerships is like, how do we account for these like large scale, like 5 blocks of a clear cut altogether in relationship to the other pieces that are going on? And so I think it really notes like the need, like, how do we communicate of like, okay, it looks like I've got a logger that's got state, county, and maybe some private land. They're gonna cut this. Know them, I kind of know their business model. If we get a good winter, they're gonna try to go through all of these because they're right next to each other, because that reduces equipment moving, that is efficient, that's all kinds of things. And so then what does that look like in the surrounding areas to be maintaining components or also even benefiting from like, okay, if there's kind of an older one, wow, you've got early successional habitat, some great bugs, some great forage, some great all kinds of stuff. And then is there enough later successional habitat that's not in the, like, not coming up for harvest in the next, hopefully like 30, 40 years to be able to come up. So I know there's a lot of large landscape level planning going on in our state, but I think it highlights that communication across organizations is really, really important. Because like, for that logger to stay in business, that's what they need to be able to account for and take advantage of the winter, because they don't know what next winter is gonna look like. So how can you pair this together of like, they need to be able to make a profit to stay in business, we need to do forest management, but we also have the 17, 18 million acres. So how do we play this game of like chess and checkers and maybe sorry, as well as like shoots and ladders on the board together? Don't actually know what the rules will be next year, but being able to talk, I think, is the biggest thing.
Yeah, the only other thing I would add to that too is, these are different times, and for all of the reasons that we've talked about, we need to have different conversations than what we were having 10 years ago, even 20 years ago. What is the priority for Minnesota's forests? What do we need to do, and what do we need to maybe do differently? And maybe it's from the very top, rethinking about, certain cover types on school trust lands. Maybe we need to rethink those policies. Maybe we really need to give a lot of autonomy to the wildlife biologists on wildlife lands to make sure we're never doing those clear cuts there. So we have that triad kind of approach. Those conversations are really tough. I know they're happening. I know that they're creating a lot of maybe conflict and stress in people's jobs, but they need to be had in a really respectful way. And hopefully all of our science can sort of support. We don't know exactly what any one stand should do or what any one manager should do, but here's a whole bunch of different options that we haven't been considering before very recently. And hopefully some leaders in the state that sort of manage a lot of the forests will start being engaged in those conversations in a little bit more holistic way. Chances.
Dale?
Yeah, and I was interested to hear you talk about the plight of the Connecticut warbler, and was curious if you guys have any more, if there's, like, is there a species management plan? Are there things that you think could move the needle there that have to be tried, that are, as far as management strategies that we can try and work on with different land agencies and whatnot? Just any thoughts on what we ought to do about that?
Yes, we have a Connecticut warbler working group that is 30 of us that have worked on Connecticut warblers throughout its entire range, and so a lot of Canadian folks. And then we do have a couple of collaborators down in the non-breeding area as well, but that's kind of a black box. In terms of in Minnesota, really, we've documented range contraction, like Josh had mentioned. We used to see them pretty regularly. In Chippewa Superior National Forest, they're really not there very much. Same thing in Michigan and in Wisconsin. So we're definitely seeing that range shift happening. There's still a really nice population, high density in the Red Lake peatlands. And so I think that has to be sort of a conservation star for that, and we have to maybe work together to get some protections down for their habitat in similar ways that they did with Kirtlands, for example, in other states. But really, it's a very understudied species, it's low density, it's spread out across a lot of different areas. And so we need a lot of information, and so that's what the working group is really focusing on. What are the conservation priorities? How do we track them? What do we know about habitats across the range? They, like Josh said, they can benefit from forest management. I know they've lost habitat in different parts of Canada because of land use conversions. So where are their population sort of pockets? Where can we do the protection and where can we do management? We're racing against a really ticking time bomb, I guess, in Minnesota, but we do have to decide, like, is this worth conserving? Do we want to lose biodiversity for climate change? We're at that part in our society where we're just gonna have to, like, do we have to think about it more and invest more? Because yeah, that's, if it's anything like Wisconsin, we have about 10 years and probably be here.
Yeah, to add to that, I mean, we're basically down with black spruce. And so these alternatives, I think, are a great way to kind of work there. But is there a way that we can get tamarack back in the landscape faster?
Yeah, come on, Marcella.
That would help. I mean, they like both black spruce and tamarack, and losing, I don't know, close to 1 million acres of tamarack that's been attempted. That's meaningful, so can we get tamarack back?
Well, I think that question brings up a really critical point, is like, when we think about habitat, and I know I'm preaching to the choir, it's not habitat today, it's habitat throughout the time. And so we saw tamarack and it really moved like other bark beetles, where it went from really healthy, biggest, like the best tamarack, and then piddled down into like, okay, areas of higher density, okay, areas with random, like bigger trees. So it moved like a bark beetle moves in ponderosa pine or lodgepole pine. And so the areas that we see some healthy tamarack are areas of higher diversity, but it paints a picture of like, if we had maybe a stronger tamarack market, we would have more younger or medium-sized age classes that were not at the stage where the beetle is attracted to it yet. So it has to have enough phloem for it. But without a market, we're not managing. And so we're just getting older trees. And that can be really, really great for many things until we have something like this. And then as we had, this has been going on for now 24, 25 years. We've not been able to actively manage during that 25 years because of the market. So we haven't been able to try certain things of, okay, can we put like breaks in, or can we do some regeneration harvest early in the ELB outbreak in a stand to then get that regeneration coming in while maintaining the structure of like, no, these trees are gonna die, but they're gonna put out a ton of seeds. So we're gonna keep the dead trees, we're gonna keep what is living, and even the catching up of like, are there trees that might be more resistant or resilient to them? We're like, well, no, maybe. And we did some of that work that's moving through the publication piece. And like, so we see there's some genetic differences in tamarack, but the thing that was more kind of a bummer is we might be seeing 3 waves of ELB. So we knew there was 2, but we might be seeing ELB attacked trees at 3 different kind of times. So they generally attack early in the season, and now we're seeing a second wave, but we're also seeing a potential later 3rd wave with our longer growing season, which is like not good at all with that condition. So wish I could say like we could get them faster, but this is something where like it may sound counterintuitive, but doing regeneration harvest can set us up for stands that are younger and more resilient in the future, accounting for the need that something could happen to our older stands. So not saying we want all young stands, but how do we create this age class diversity?
With that, I think we're gonna have to end the panel, but thank you so much for your participation.